So today we are diving deep into the really fascinating connection between psilocybin, yep, the compound in magic mushrooms, and human creativity. We're going to connect some cutting-edge neuroscience with ancient philosophy to figure out what it all means for that spark of inspiration. Let's get into it.
I mean, that's a pretty wild question, right? But it's one that artists, thinkers, and innovators have been wrestling with for centuries. Is there some kind of creative superpower hidden in letting go of our normal, everyday way of thinking?
And look, this isn't just some abstract philosophical idea. We're talking about real-world breakthroughs. From the entire design philosophy behind Apple to Francis Crick literally visualizing the double helix shape of DNA, and even a Nobel Prize-winning scientific technique, some of the biggest leaps of the 20th century have been linked to these kinds of experiences.
So, what is this spark of madness they talk about? To really get how psychedelics could be a key to creativity, we first have to understand what happens when we take a little step outside the boundaries of our normal waking consciousness.
Okay, so now for the really cool part. Let's look at what's physically happening inside the brain. Because of modern brain imaging, we can actually watch how psilocybin rewires our mind in real time. And honestly, it's spectacular.
The main character in this story is something called the Default Mode Network, or DMN for short. You can pretty much think of it as the brain's CEO. It's your ego center. It's that inner voice that's always narrating your life, the part that worries about the past and plans for the future. Its job is to keep everything orderly and maintain your solid sense of you.
So what does psilocybin do to that CEO? Well, it essentially tells it to take a nice, long vacation. The activity in the DMN drops. And I mean dramatically. Look at this. It drops way more than even during deep meditation. And this quieting of the ego, well, it's the key to everything that happens next.
So, with the boss out of the office, the rest of the brain kind of starts to party. Neuroscientists have a great name for this: hyperconnectivity. All these different parts of your brain that usually stick to their own departments suddenly start talking to each other, cross-linking like crazy. It's like a massive fireworks show of new connections.
And we're not just talking about a few extra phone calls between brain regions. We're talking about a temporary 71% increase in neural connections. That is a huge number. And this massive flood of new communication is what creates all these novel associations, which are the literal building blocks of a creative idea.
All of this leads to a concept that scientists call the entropic brain hypothesis. Now, entropy is just a fancy word for disorder or chaos. The idea is that psilocybin pushes your brain into a more chaotic, less predictable, and less rigid state. But think of it less like random noise and more like a jazz band improvising freely instead of a classical orchestra reading sheet music. It's in that flexible, chaotic state that brand new patterns and totally new ideas can form.
Now here's what's so incredible. This idea of an entropic brain, a mind that's been let off its leash, it's not new at all. In a way, our cutting-edge neuroscience is just now proving what philosophers have been talking about for thousands of years.
I mean, the idea that real, raw creativity bubbles up from somewhere beyond our normal, rational mind is an ancient one. You can trace this exact thought from Plato in ancient Greece talking about divine madness, through the philosopher Nietzsche, all the way to a brilliant metaphor that Aldous Huxley gave us in the 1950s.
Nietzsche had this idea that creativity is a dance between two forces. On one side, you have the Apollonian. That's order, logic, structure. That's the architect. On the other side, you have the Dionysian. That's chaos, passion, intuition, the improvising jazz musician. He said you need both, but the really groundbreaking stuff, that comes from tapping into that wild Dionysian energy. Psilocybin, you could argue, is like a shot of pure Dionysian chaos.
And that brings us to Aldous Huxley. He imagined the brain as a reducing valve. Its main job is to filter out the absolutely overwhelming flood of reality just so we can focus on surviving. Finding food and not getting eaten. Psychedelics, he suggested, just open that valve up for a while, letting in a torrent of unfiltered information, perspective, and ideas. It's a perfect philosophical mirror for what those brain scans are showing us today.
So let's connect the dots here. We've got the science of a less constrained, hyper-connected brain, and we've got the philosophy of inspiration coming from beyond our everyday self. How do these two things come together to create that aha moment?
Well, it all leads to what you might call the paradox of the ego. We tend to think of creativity as the ultimate act of self-expression, my art, my ideas. But what if the secret to our most brilliant work is actually getting yourself out of the way?
This is the experience known as ego dissolution, And it's directly tied to that drop in DMN activity we saw earlier. When the brain's CEO goes quiet, that constant feeling of being a separate I starts to fade. The inner critic shuts up, self-consciousness vanishes, and artists often say it feels like ideas are just flowing through them, not from them. They become a channel.
And the creative benefit of this is just huge. When you temporarily lose the filter of your ego and all its baggage, you can regain a kind of childlike wonder. You start to see the world with fresh eyes, where an ordinary object on your desk can seem totally extraordinary. It's the ultimate way to break out of those mental ruts we all get stuck in.
But here's the thing, the psychedelic experience itself is just the first step. The real creative magic often happens in what's called the afterglow, that period of heightened brain flexibility that can last for days or weeks. This is the crucial time for integration, for taking those wild new insights and deliberately applying them through journaling, making art, and turning a flash of inspiration into something real and lasting.
Ultimately, this whole story points to a pretty universal truth about how creativity works. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important thing we can do isn't to try harder or think more, but to simply let go. So I'll leave you with this. What creative walls in your own life could you break down, not by forcing them, but by just getting out of your own way?